Dancing actress Leslie Caron confronted her trauma by sharing her horrifying story with the world. There is indeed a villain here. In her autobiography, Leslie points an accusatory finger, painting a scathing portrait of the one person responsible for her tragic undoing. But we will touch more on this point later on. At first glance, it seemed like Leslie Caron had won the birth lottery. On July 1st, 1931, she entered the world, and what a comfortable one it was for her. Her French father, Claude, was a pharmacist from a well-to-do family, while her American mother, a former Broadway dancer, injected some fire into the prim and proper French family she'd married into. For little Leslie, her childhood seemed like every girl's dream, but little did she know it was about to change dramatically. You see, Leslie's mother Margaret couldn't be bothered with her children. To make matters worse, her favorite nanny left them when she was only 5 years old. Although Leslie wasn't always her mother's first priority, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. In her autobiography, Thank Heaven, Caron describes her early passion for dance, and it all came down to one nerve-wracking childhood memory. With every opportunity available to her, Leslie proved that she had the grace and style to follow in her mother's footsteps as a dancer. In her autobiography, she remembered standing at the top of her home's large main staircase, while her mother and her Austrian nanny stood 2 floors below, holding her panties open so that she could jump down into them. In what must have been an anxiety-inducing action for anyone with a fear of heights, young Leslie took a deep breath and jumped, and said herself she was delighted by the flight and landed lightly with her 2 feet passing gracefully through the leg holes. In one fell swoop, a dancing queen was born. But sadly, not even discovering her passion could make little Leslie happy. Unfortunately, the only thing more determined than a child starving for attention was Leslie literally starving herself for attention. At the beginning of what would be a lifetime of food issues, including 7 bouts of anorexia, Leslie went on a hunger strike at the age of 5, and the pounds started dropping off at an alarming rate. Her parents consulted countless doctors, one of whom made a drastic suggestion. He recommended sending Leslie to boarding school in Switzerland. He thought the fresh air would make her hungry. However, this was only but the beginning. Desperate to find a solution, Leslie's parents gave permission to quote-unquote cure their daughter of her eating disorder. This was a huge mistake. This headmistress would sit beside her and try to force feed Leslie. When that didn't work, she would lock the poor girl in the bathroom, making sure her cheeks were stuffed with hidden food, and give her strict orders to swallow or else. Leslie was a fragile child, consumed by her eating disorder, but fate had another cruel twist in store for her. As if the force-feeding wasn't bad enough, Leslie caught scarlet fever while at boarding school. So not only did she have to have her head shaved, but she was also forced to quarantine alone. This horror show came to a disturbing climax when Leslie's mother noticed lumps in her cheeks during a visit. She pried open her daughter's bulging mouth and found a disgusting amount of old food. For Leslie, it seemed like life couldn't get any worse, but she was so wrong. In the blink of an eye, Leslie went from the horrors of boarding school to the horrors of World War II. Her family's lifestyle went from champagne and caviar to potato peels and horse meat. Leslie even had to make her own shoes out of her great-grandmother's opera gloves. Even now, she sticks slivers of soap together so they don't go to waste. It was a brutal awakening for Leslie's entire family, and the consequences were horrifying. Despite growing up poor, Leslie's mother was not the "at least we have love" kind of person. Devastated by the family's newfound financial hardship, she began to drink even more than usual. Through the haze of it all, her mother managed to concoct a money-making plan. Now, we aren't saying she was a gold digger, but Leslie's mother made it her mission to ensure that her daughter would marry into money and become a princess. Leslie was a beautiful and talented dancer, and according to her mother, the only way she'd ever become a royal was if she became a professional ballerina. And so, during one fateful Sunday lunch, Leslie made a shocking announcement. With her mother's encouragement, Leslie told her entire family, "I want to be a ballet dancer." However, this was met with a negative reaction. However, it didn't faze Leslie, and the young girl finally had a goal in mind, rising out of the darkness of her childhood and reaching towards the light. Caron must have inherited her mother's genes because she loved to dance, and she was so good at it. Young and sweet and only 16, she joined Roland Petit's influential ballet company in Paris. Not only was she having the time of her life, but she was also now, unbeknownst to her, firmly on the path to stardom. You couldn't have planned this next moment better if you wished upon a star. When Leslie was just 17, a vacationing Gene Kelly, the legendary dancing movie star, saw her dance in Paris and was extremely impressed. A mere 18 months later, this little Parisian girl traveled to America to star in a feature film called An American in Paris, and now there was no turning back anymore. Leslie loved ballet and didn't know very much about American movies, so she was definitely not singing hooray for Hollywood. No commercials or catalog modeling for Leslie, thus she plunged right into the lead role in An American in Paris, and she definitely packed a punch with her French feistiness. In fact, her stubbornness stunned the studios. She wouldn't let the film stylists pluck her eyebrows or do anything to make her look like the other MGM stars. Much to everyone's shock, Leslie even tried to demonstrate the look she wanted. With a flourish, Leslie hacked off most of her hair with a pair of nail scissors. Let's just say the studio didn't appreciate her aesthetic. In a later interview, Leslie remembered the occasion fondly, saying, "So I arrived for the first day of shooting looking like a drowned cat." Well, when the new actress stepped onto the set, she got quite a dramatic reaction. Everyone on set was horrified by what Leslie had done to her hair. They placed her in front of a lineup of disappointed studio heads, and as they stood there shaking their heads, Gene Kelly suggested they shoot some other scenes to give Leslie's hair some time to grow in. In private, Gene admonished her and said that studios had fired girls for less. Unfortunately, this wasn't her only misstep. Later on, Leslie herself admits that the French are a bit laissez-faire with time. And when she arrived late to set, Gene Kelly asked if she had an alarm clock. After apologizing and saying she didn't even own a watch, Kelly said, "Honey, the war is over, and you can go into any drugstore and buy yourself an alarm clock." If those on-set shenanigans aren't bad enough, the tardy actress had other issues. To top it all off, Leslie came down with mono during filming and had to power through it. It is hardly a surprise if you've considered her malnutrition compounded by the stress of a high-stakes job in a new country. However, no one puts Leslie in the corner, not even mono. Long before the wet chair scene in Flashdance, Caron had her own sexy chair number. Leslie innocently says all she did was do what the choreographer was suggesting, but her moves were way too hot for the censors. The choreographer cleaned up the dance, and luckily all of her trouble was about to pay off in the best way possible. To Leslie's delight, An American in Paris went on to win 6 Oscars, including Best Picture, which is surprising once you realize that it was up against A Place in the Sun and A Streetcar Named Desire. MGM even ran an ad showing their embarrassed lion mascot, saying, "Honestly, I was just sitting in the sun waiting for a streetcar." Leslie had dominated her first romance. But her real-life romance wasn't exactly a fairy tale. Leslie was no country bumpkin, but she did say she was a virgin princess when she got to Hollywood. This may explain why shortly after her arrival, at the age of 20, she married Geordie Hormel. Unsurprisingly, her first kick at the can did not go very well. Leslie tied the knot with Geordie in Las Vegas. Shortly after rousing the minister at the Little Church of the West, she heard herself saying, "I do." It was a moment of excitement, but it burned out as quickly as it ignited. In a short time, Leslie morphed from a virgin princess to a desperate housewife. She admitted that she was pious enough to wait until marriage, but then added, "What I learned was so disappointing I had to get out." Her childhood marriage, as she called it, was now over. But even though Leslie's marriage was over, the ensuing fallout was a full-blown mess. To escape her disappointing marriage, Leslie fled to New York to reunite with Roland Petit. While she was there, the news broke that her husband was a drug addict. The ensuing divorce was nasty, complete with high-priced lawyers accusing her of cheating so that Geordie wouldn't have to pay alimony. Behind closed doors, the actress suffered, but out in the spotlight, her performances were unshakable. Even though Leslie's personal life was going horribly, her film career plugged along impressively. In 1955, she starred alongside Fred Astaire in Daddy Longlegs, making her part of a small club of only 6 women who have danced with both Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire in movies. Now, if only her love life would straighten up and fly right. Falling for the boss is never a good idea, but the way Leslie describes her director, Peter Hall, makes him sound so hard to resist. Tall, handsome, brilliant, charming, and persuasive. She met him in 1956, when he was directing her in a stage version of Gigi. Let's just say things were intense right from the get-go. On Gigi's opening night, the tension between Leslie and Peter came to a dramatic climax. They had been attracted to one another for such a long time, but they kept their relationship professional while working together. But all of that was about to change. That night, their feelings couldn't be denied, and they finally acted upon their desires. Although Leslie and Peter didn't get hitched in Vegas, they did get married later that year after Leslie became pregnant with her first child. Domestic life was blissful, despite the fact that Leslie broke her contract with MGM to move to London. It was a huge sacrifice to make, but would this delightful honeymoon phase last? After the success of the stage play Gigi, Leslie was able to play a 14-year-old at the age of 27 in the 1958 film adaptation. Even though they had to finesse some of the costumes, it was still quite the feat, especially considering that Leslie was a mother herself. The film went on to sweep the Oscars. This golden girl could do no wrong, at least for now. When it came to her marriage, the flourishing actress had a rude awakening. Perhaps this golden couple was only gold-plated because, over time, their romance began to tarnish. Although Leslie and Peter now had a daughter and a son, in the perfect millionaire's family, there was nothing perfect about Leslie's state of mind. She wanted better roles in her husband's productions, while he wanted her to be a dedicated little housewife. Growing relentless, Leslie decided to make a great escape. In what seemed to be a pattern in her past marriages, Leslie escaped to film Father Goose in 1963. While attending a party, she found herself sitting across from one of the hottest heartthrobs in the business. The champagne was flowing, the air was electric, And Warren Beatty, one of the most striking men in Hollywood, had the spotlight of his attention pointed directly at Leslie Caron. After a night of flirty remarks, Warren offered to take her back to her hotel. The little Leslie was no longer a virgin princess, but she was clearly facing a formidable opponent. Warren Beatty did not seduce over an alleged 12,000 women by accident after all. So of course, he didn't just drop her off at her hotel. In her book, she writes, "I lingered another week in Beverly Hills and had what they call a good old time. But this fantasy couldn't last forever. It must have been hard for Leslie to leave her paramour's side after an illicit week of red-hot romance, especially considering what she would face back home in England." After confessing to her husband and telling him she wanted to separate, he suggested a trip to save the marriage, as one does. But it did not go well. Leslie agreed to go on the trip, but sadly, the only heat during that trip came from the desert sun. Caron called the trip disastrous and was overcome with guilt about her children, but luckily she had a brand new love interest to ease the pain. The newly divorced Leslie was flying on an oxytocin high. As she mentions, "In Hollywood, there was a place for me. Parts were coming up. I was one of the queens of Hollywood. Warren and I were like Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie." Leslie was more high profile than she ever was before, and her relationship with Warren showed no indication of slowing down. Despite Warren popping the question of marriage repeatedly, Leslie declined each time. Warren loved drama and media attention, but Leslie wanted nothing to do with it, saying, "I just couldn't accept that kind of life." Soon, their opposing personalities began pushing them toward the deep end. Leslie's relationship with Warren eventually fizzled out after a couple years, and in 1969, she married Hollywood producer Michael Laughlin. In 1975, the couple moved to Paris, but in a strange twist, Laughlin changed his mind a few days later. Leslie, however, stayed in France, but something was amiss. It became the beginning of a very long and very dark period for her. The 80s were a great time for yuppies, but not for Leslie Caron. Her third marriage had ended and her looks were fading, and additionally, the movie roles were drying up quickly. As the dark clouds of depression rolled in, Leslie started to worry that she was heading down the same dangerous path as her mother. Leslie was always an actress torn between two countries, France and America. While trying to adjust to her new life in Paris, she came to a disturbing realization. She felt she was not French enough for French filmmakers, in that they were pushing her for her success in America. She regretted returning to France and began drinking to numb the pain. She started restoring an old inn in Burgundy, but it wasn't exactly as dreamy a project as it seemed. There was a lot of work, loneliness, and worries about money. To make matters worse, Leslie's growing sadness couldn't be contained. In 1993, the inn opened, but sadly, Leslie was too exhausted and anxious to be proud of all that she had accomplished. She was drinking heavily so that she could pass out as quickly as possible and forget the anxiety. She feared that she'd end up like her mother, who tragically passed away in 1967, but she couldn't do anything to stop it. Then the worst happened. One morning, Leslie woke up and wanted to end it all. She washed down too many pills with too many drinks. She later described this movement as a bit of a gamble. You toss it up in the air to see if you're going to wake up. Thankfully, she pulled through, and the distraught actress woke up 2 days later and decided that it was time to seek help. After this terrifying episode, Leslie spent a month in the hospital. It was exactly what she needed to begin healing. She started therapy, went to AA, and began to write her memoirs. Surprisingly, she said it was the writing that really helped her to come to terms with her past. Her words, though, absolutely scathing. She realized that she had been eaten up by the personality of her mother, and that she had finally severed the umbilical cord. The recent pandemic caused a lot of people to reevaluate their lives, and Leslie was among them. Despite taking on occasional acting gigs and even winning an Emmy for a 2006 appearance on Law & Order, but after all she had done, Leslie decided to retire. It seemed like she finally managed to find her happily ever after. She hasn't touched a drink in decades, hangs out with her dog, and loves being able to stay up late and sleep in. It sounds like a life worth living. Don't forget, if you've enjoyed this story or stories alike, make sure to show some love by subscribing and liking this video. Stay tuned for some more informative and exciting stories like this one.